so far. One thing, I mean, we just have to get our basics right. This whole thing, it's not about economy. It's not about rationality. I think it needs to point out because, and it's not about military rational, military strategic thinking. Okay, he's ahead of us all the time. And I think it just needs to point out also, second point, what happened to Crimea? Why are we here? Why are we constantly talking about the federalization of the Ukraine and the constitutional environment of the Ukraine? What happened to Crimea? Why don't we talk about Crimea more? Which brings me to my third point. I'd argue that there is no post-crisis of this whole thing. It's a new stage. It's a completely new environment that we have to deal with. I completely agree with Vladimir, who talked about the social tensions that hasn't gone away. I also, as a special interest, follow the developments in the North Caucasus, and it hasn't gone away. There are people dying in the North Caucasus every day, as we sit here and speak, as to that conflict. We just look the other way now. Also, in terms of domestic things and the leadership, I really appreciate Vladimir for pointing out the crudeness of the political leadership. And I was myself in Moscow a couple of weeks ago, and someone put it rather accurately, I thought, and to the point. This is the first political leadership in Russian history who doesn't anticipate that their children will grow up and live in Russia. So, and as to what Ed was talking about, Russian warfare in this whole situation, and what you said about lies. I think that's also worth pointing out and studying as the whole spectrum of lies that everything means the opposite. I mean, this is newspeak. When Putin says we want a stable Ukraine, he means we want an unstable Ukraine. When he said, which he did, I checked it out on the 4th of March, we have absolutely no interest in Crimea. It means we have every interest in Crimea. However, it's also true that sometimes, since I've been very much involved in studying the documents and the doctrines, the military doctrines and whatnot, and people have told me that, waste of time, it's just paperwork. Well, no, it's not. And I'll show it to you, I'll prove it in a little while, but I'll come back to the warfare bit. There was a conference in the Ministry of Defense in Moscow last year. And there, actually, the head of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, showed a slide where he sort of explained his view on future modern conflicts. And it follows that scheme to the point, what's happening in Crimea. And I actually wrote a little bit about it last year. And he also points out there that the non-military means versus military means in future military conflict is 4 to 1. So this is what we're seeing here. Also, in terms of propaganda and soft power, last year there was a new foreign policy concept adopted in February, and this is the first time the phrasing mjäkiä sila, soft power, is used in that document, and they define it. Clearly, it says, on the one hand, soft power can be used as a complement to classic diplomacy. On the other hand, there is a risk that soft power is used as a tool to interfere into domestic affair of states through, and I quote, among other things, to finance humanitarian projects and projects relating to human rights abroad. So only from this, it's very clear that the definition of soft power has nothing to do with the traditional one, Joseph Nye, about increasing the attraction of one's country. And it's also very linked to the use of hard power and military things. But Vladimir Putin defines soft power as instruments and methods to achieve foreign policy objectives without the use of weapons, information, and other levers of influence. And then he comes back to the language thing. But if we look at the military doctrine of 2010, it clearly states that it allows the use of force to protect Russian citizens abroad. And it's legitimate to use the armed forces to ensure protection of its citizens located beyond the borders of the Russian Federation in accordance with generally recognized principles and norms of international law. You will be able to read about the Russian view on soft power in a study that will be published briefly. It was more or less done already last year, and this is my point, that sometimes they actually mean what they say. And finally, one thing that we haven't touched upon so much, I mean, the Putin doctrine has been mentioned, but I'd like to underline the ethnic element of that doctrine. And it's been clear from the beginning, and it became even more clear in the phone-in 4-hour conference that Putin staged just before Easter, where he gets a question of, what does it mean, Russianness? What does the Russian man mean to you? And then he launches into a long explanation about climate, history, territory, and shared experiences. And then he ends the whole thing with saying that there is also a saying in Russia that in the world, death is beautiful. And the willingness for Russians to die for one's own country is a special national trait. To me, that means he is preparing the home audience for something maybe worse to come.
Thank you very much. I'll very soon allow Edward to comment on the comments. But
Karen, can I just make one quick point?
Yeah, sure.
One very quick
Absolutely.
point of what Gudrun said. Thank you very much for the points you made. And I just want to make a quick addition. You said you quoted the doctrine about protecting Russian citizens abroad. Well, now Putin's put it on a new level in the same teleconference that you've mentioned. He now talked about protecting Russian speakers abroad, which is a whole different thing. Yeah. You know, by that definition, you know, the majority language, for example, in Brooklyn, New York, is Russian. by that definition, you can stretch it and protect people there. Especially relevant for the Baltic states, I would suggest, this shift from citizens to speakers. And also just to make a point that this is obviously all bogus about the need to protect and so on. I spoke with Evgeny Kiselyov a couple of days ago, who was previously one of the most prominent journalists in Russia until he was purged by Putin. He now works in Ukraine.
The good Kiselyov.
The good Kiselyov, absolutely. There are two Kiselyovs. This is the good one, not the propagandist. And he'd worked on Soviet TV in his youth, and he said that Soviet TV was actually, if that's possible, was actually better than what we have today, because on Soviet TV they took the facts and twisted them, in favor of the official Kremlin position. Now they make up the facts. They just know facts, to tell. There was this famous story a couple of weeks ago when two different channels of Russian television showed one man, on one channel they said this is a member of the People's Self-Defense Force in Donetsk. In other TV channel, he was a mercenary of Western Ukrainian Banderovites who was sent to the same person. So they didn't even bother to check. So the professionalism is pretty low as well. And on this point of bogus facts, there is frankly, the only Russian speakers who need protecting, are citizens of Russia, and they need protection from Putin. This problem is bogus. As I mentioned, I came from Kiev 2 days ago. Everybody speaks Russian. That's not a problem. Obviously, I shouldn't even be saying these things. These are banal truths, but I guess they have to be said in the context of what Putin's propaganda is saying. I was in Riga in February, speaking at the Sejm, at the Latvian Parliament, and lots of people speak Russian in Riga. When I spoke Russian, nobody killed me, nobody arrested me. This is just all a big pack of lies, frankly. And I know everybody here knows it, but it still needs to be said now and again, just to stress what the extent of those lies and what the scale of those lies is that people of Russia are getting thrown at them every single day.
Mm.
No, absolutely. My point of quoting the doctrine is actually there already years back.
Yeah.
So.
Could you just briefly say a few words about the concept of Nova Russia that comes out from Kremlin all the time? Well, actually, both of you, but I thought perhaps Gudrun could start. Obviously, there's been reports that this is something that is widely used now in Odessa, for instance, by pro-Russian activists, and that it's spreading. And if you could say a few words about how the EU should deal with that as well, since we have not least the Baltic states should perhaps pay attention to the wider use of that term.
Right. It's a term coined by Catherine the Great when the Russian Empire grew, and it's Odessa and then on south and up to Kharkiv. And Putin has been talking about this as Novorossiya, Nova Russia, and saying that even during Tsarist time, this was never part of Ukraine, and therefore implicitly it's ours to take. Speaking of Odessa in Russian television, ever since this whole thing started, there are constant reports of the repressed Russian population in Odessa, and you can see demonstrations and things. I've talked to people who've been to Odessa; they haven't seen anything at all. There are no demonstrations, just on the media hype. But and another thing that's worrying about this whole thing is when Putin says that he wants to correct historical mistakes, because that's sort of, he uses that as an argument, and God knows where that will stop. When it comes to what the EU could do, I'm sure there are people here that are better suited to answer that question than I am. But I've been thinking that EU should immediately introduce visa-free regime with the Ukraine as a token of support. Something that I was told in Moscow was that the targeted sanctions are actually a very good thing, And what the West should do is to sharpen the lists and increase the pace, so that it and broadens the sanctions to cover more. The idea being, if you target the clans around Putin quickly, they will perhaps unite and then get rid of Putin. Maybe you can.
No, absolutely. That last point is absolutely true. And I think when change will come to Russia, it will be a combination of mass pressure from below, as we've seen the mass demonstrations in 2011, 2012, and a split in the elites, as in fact happened in Ukraine during the Orange Revolution in 2004, and in the peaceful scenario, which we're all hoping for, of course. And just a couple of words on Novorossiya, on your question, Karen. When Putin is talking about all this, he's deliberately substituting, twisting, the facts. What he calls Russian lands are actually, what he means are lands that used to belong to the Russian Empire. And of course, the Russian Empire and present-day Russia are two very different things. When he says that these lands, did not belong to Ukraine, well, there was no Ukraine back then. Of course, they didn't belong to it. Once there was a time when India and Rhodesia and all these other places were British. So what does that mean? Can you imagine David Cameron talking about, Rhodesia today? He's deliberately twisting it, of course, and people understand that he's deliberately twisting it. And of course, one thing he also said was when he spoke to Mustafa Dzhemilov, the leader of the Crimean Tatars, by phone, I guess this is now about a month ago, he finished the conversation by saying that Ukraine left the USSR in a not very legal fashion. That's what he said. And of course, we all responded. The Russian opposition all responded that he kind of forgot the fact that the USSR was created in a not very legal fashion through a forceful coup d'état. So these are the things that need to be answered, because this falsification and twisting of history to suit the regime's political ends, these should be answered, and they are answered. They are answered in what little remains of the public space for debate in Russia, the few remaining islands of media freedom that we have. You see these absurd claims being answered, and we'll continue to do it.
Edward.
Yeah, there's a lot of points there, and I want to get on to the Q&A. I think we tend to have a rather sort of reductionist attitude when we deal with Russia, where we think it must be either A or B, and which is it? And actually things tend to have multiple causes and multiple motivations. So I think it's probably a false choice to try and argue about whether this is about Putin's foreign policy objectives or whether it's about whipping up support at home. It's both. This does play political dividends at home. He knows from the Bronze Soldier in Tallinn and from the Georgian War and from some of the other things that have attracted less attention that the public likes to see Russia standing up for itself. And it plays on the feelings of humiliation and powerlessness from the 1990s, and it does work quite well. And yes, he was in some trouble with his public standing, because basically, this is a point we should be driving home again and again and again, the modernization project hasn't worked. Russia still has bad public services, bad infrastructure, terrible corruption. And Russians are quite blunt about this. If you ask them in opinion polls, are you satisfied with almost every aspect of daily life, they say no. Do you like Putin? Yes. And there's reasons for that. One is that he's made sure there's no alternative, and some Russians just feel, well, although he's corrupt and incompetent, he's perhaps better than who we might get afterwards. But that doesn't mean it's not also bringing benefits to him, and in a way, by manipulating the external environment, not only making sure that Ukraine doesn't become a success story, but that the EU doesn't look credible and threatening. That also plays well at home and makes him safer abroad. I think it's also just one small note on this business of the regime that doesn't expect its children to live there. I think it's very useful to think about this in terms of the Sicilian mafia. The Sicilian mafia has an absolute grip on Sicily. It invests a lot of its money outside Sicily. They may support Sicilian football teams and think that Sicily is the most wonderful place in the world. They don't actually want their children necessarily to grow up there. If you want to really understand Russian politics, I suggest watching The Sopranos. Finally, a point on the Newspeak. I think one of the great achievements that they've had has been to try and impose their political lexicon on us. They've created this idea that there is a political category called Russian speaker. This is an astonishing piece of impudence. There is no political category called Russian speaker any more than there's a political category of English speaker or German speaker. It's essentially absurd to think that we, all three of us here, or maybe all four of us on the panel, are all Russian speakers. We don't expect the Russian Navy to come protect us anymore. We expect the British Navy to come protect us because we're all speaking English. The idea of fascist, that fascism is a political category, and anti-fascism is a political category, that it makes sense to have a movement sponsored by the Kremlin called Mir bez nazismu, the world without Nazism, which goes around America promoting the Russian foreign policy agenda, dressed up as this is the way to keep Nazism from coming back to Europe. We need to be much more alert on this, and I am astonished by how often mainstream Western media, which should know better, just lazily picks up these terms in a way we'd never have picked up in the Soviet era, Soviet propaganda terms like progressive-minded people all over the world. Some of us old enough to remember these sort of things. And you had a kind of mental filter. If you saw one of these Soviet propaganda phrases, peace-minded people, peace-loving peoples of the world, you knew that wasn't really peace-loving peoples of the world. That was people from the Soviet front organizations.